The death penalty. Probably one of the most controversial issues worldwide. Now, the controversy surrounding the death penalty is not new. Rather, it dates back to the beginnings of this country when the death penalty was brought over by England. Now, the United States stands as one of the last developed nations in the world who still imposes the death penalty in capital cases. In fact, the world's top 5 executioners in 2014, the United States was number 5. Now, public opinion on the death penalty has actually gotten pretty disfavorable over the past years. In fact, a recent study in 2010 by the Lake Research Partners shows that public opinion has actually favored other punishments besides the death penalty. As for a deterrent on crime, the statistics actually show the opposite. The statistics actually show that the highest murder rates are in the South, and that's where the highest executions take place. The lowest murder rates are in New England, and that's where the lowest executions take place. Now, as for some statistics, there has been not only controversies surrounding putting people to death in general, but there's also controversies surrounding the fact that the death penalty seems to disfavor minorities over whites. Now, jurors in Washington state are 3 times more likely to recommend a death sentence for a black defendant than for a white defendant in a similar case. And in Louisiana, the odds of a death sentence were 97% higher for those whose victim was white than for those whose victim was black. And a recent study in California found that those who killed whites were over 3 times more likely to be sentenced to death than those who killed blacks, and over 4 times more likely than those who killed Latinos. Now, since 1973, over 150 people have been released from death row with evidence of their innocence. And this is evidence of their innocence. From 1973 to 1999, there was an average of 3 exonerations per year. And from 2000 to 2011, there was an average of 5 exonerations per year. Now, as for the death penalty, the South, as I indicated, has the highest murder rate out of anywhere else in the country, and they also impose the most executions. Now, as for financial facts pertaining to the death penalty, which is commonly a justification used as a means to keep the death penalty, studies have shown that someone on death row costs states much more money than someone who gets life without the possibility of parole. For instance, defense costs for death penalty trials in Kansas averaged about $400,000 per case compared to $100,000 per case when the death penalty was not sought. A new study in California revealed that the cost of the death penalty in the state has been over $4 billion since 1978. And study considered pretrial and trial costs, costs of automatic appeals and state habeas corpus petitions, costs of federal habeas corpus appeals, and costs of incarceration on death row. And enforcing the death penalty costs Florida $51 million a year above what it would cost to punish all first-degree murderers with life in prison without parole. And based on the 44 executions Florida has carried out since 1976, that amounts to a cost of $24 million per each execution. So imposing the death penalty is not a very cheap method. It also seems to be a very biased method. And it also seems to be a very controversial method. Whether you're for it or against it, this is something that dates back to our history And as I indicated, the controversy surrounding it dates back to the beginnings of our country. Now, the controversies that I mentioned aren't the only controversies behind the death penalty. There's also controversies in the way the death penalty is administered. There's controversies over, in cases of lethal injection, the drugs that are used, the fact that counterfeit drugs may be used, the fact that there may be botched executions. And here, there's many ways that over the years, the United States has chosen to go about executing someone on death row. We've had lethal injection, and a lot of times people are able to go and witness this. And that's not only the case in lethal injection, but that's the case in a lot of executions involving death row inmates. The drugs, as I indicated, has been a major controversy because a lot of the pharmacies that were shipping and a lot of the drug companies that were shipping the drugs to the United States for use in execution stopped doing it when they found out that those drugs were being used for executions. And other states some have still have the firing squad that's used as an execution tool. Some states hanging, and some states still utilize the electric chair, which we've all heard of. Now, I'm going to switch gears here a little bit, and what I'm going to talk about is the most recent controversy surrounding the death penalty. And when I say the most recent, I mean within this past year. And the most recent controversy surrounding the death penalty actually involves the state of Florida. In the state of Florida, the death penalty has been struck down twice within the past year. Now, as a means for a background, I just want to talk to you about Ring v. Arizona. This was a case in 2002 where the Supreme Court struck down Arizona's death penalty scheme, whereby the judge, rather than a jury, decided whether the criminal offender, whether the person who committed the capital crime was going to face death or not. Fast forward to the beginning of this year, and the U.S. Supreme Court heard another case, Hearst v. Florida. The background of this case, Hearst v. Florida, was in Hearst, the jury, and this has been essentially the procedure that's been used since the death penalty was reinstated back in the mid-1970s. In Florida, the jury would determine whether someone's aggravating factors exceeded mitigating factors as a means for death. And then what the jury would do is, the jury would then make a recommendation to the judge, and the judge would make the final determination as to whether or not the death penalty would be imposed. Well, in Hearst v. Florida, the U.S. Supreme Court held that in light of the Supreme Court's holding in Ring, that scheme of imposing the death penalty in Florida was unconstitutional. Immediately after the Hearst decision, Florida started to change the legislation behind the death penalty. And what Florida started to do was Florida started to put the burden and the decision back into the jury's hand. So essentially, the jury would decide whether or not someone who's accused of a crime, who's been convicted, would face the death penalty. If they decided that person would not face the death penalty, then that's it. That person would get life without the possibility of parole. However, what happened was the Supreme Court, the Florida legislature said that if they did, in fact, impose the death penalty, the judge could still decide to give life without the possibility of parole. Nothing wrong with that, because the issue becomes the death penalty, not life without the possibility of parole. However, what the the Florida legislature did was, the Florida legislature made it so that only 10 jurors would have to conclude that the death penalty would be imposed. And there's 12 jurors. So that means that if 10 jurors agree that the death penalty should be imposed, but 2 jurors disagree, well, guess what? That person's getting sentenced to death. Now, Darnell Perry was sentenced under this new scheme, and he appealed up to the Supreme Court of Florida. And the Supreme Court of Florida heard this appeal, and the Supreme Court of Florida held that under the Hearst decision, and given the concept of a unanimous jury verdict under due process and common law in the United States, that all 12 jurors, after weighing the aggravating and mitigating circumstances, must unanimously find that the person who was just convicted of a capital crime faces the death penalty. If one juror doesn't, then the death penalty cannot be imposed. So the law as it stands right now in Florida was struck down. And the Supreme Court made it clear that right now Florida has no death penalty law. And that's because the legislature does not reconvene for another couple of months. Now, does this mean that Perry is off the hook? No. Does it mean that all the past death row inmates who have faced the death penalty under the old and new statutes are not going to be resentenced or are going to be taken off of death row? No. What does it mean? No one knows. That's the problem. The Supreme Court has not said whether those schemes are retroactive, whether the people who are already on death row need to be resentenced. But one thing that the Supreme Court of Florida did say is that imposing the death penalty after the death penalty in Florida is found unconstitutional would not violate ex post facto. Ex post facto means punishing someone for something that essentially wasn't a punishment when they committed the act. And essentially the argument goes that since the death penalty is declared unconstitutional, that means that there is no death penalty, and essentially it didn't exist until they institute a constitutional form of the death penalty. Now, because of that, the Supreme Court of Florida, as it stands now, unless this gets appealed to the United States Supreme Court and they decide to take this case up again, they held that this is not ex post facto. Instead, it's merely something regarding the unconstitutionality of the process of the death penalty and not the death penalty itself. Therefore, all of the people who did face the death penalty and it was held that their sentence violated the constitutional rights because of the procedure, the Florida Supreme Court said that they're still able to be resentenced. So what's going to happen from this? Time will tell. We need to figure out whether or not the Florida Supreme Court is correct, whether the U.S. Supreme Court will hear another argument based upon the death penalty, and whether or not the holding in Florida v. Hearst is retroactive, so much so that all the death row inmates that are currently in Florida are afforded another sentencing opportunity.